right, guys, croissants, let's go. Nothing's better than waking up and smelling these things coming out of the oven in the morning, having your cup of coffee and a croissant with some eggs or something. It's the best. So, first you got to make the base dough. And the base dough is 100% bread flour, or I prefer all purpose, 50% water, 10% milk. You're going to go 2% salt. I use 2% diastatic malt powder, but that's optional. 10% sugar and 16.7% European unsalted butter. You're also going to laminate with 50% European unsalted butter. You don't want to use the regular store-bought butter. It's just a high water content, low butter fat content. You should have at least 80% butter fat. And it's just not as healthy. This stuff, you don't feel bad at all after eating, even though there's copious amounts of it in this. And yes, it is a little more expensive, but this is pastry, not bread. But I'm telling you, between the money you spend on the butter and the milk and the long, extensive process, it is 100% worth it. So right here, I'm just roughly kneading together everything besides the 16.7% butter that goes into the dough. I'm not doing like a full 10 minutes of kneading. I'm doing about 3 to 5 minutes of kneading just to get some kind of shaggy dough that doesn't have any dry flour. So yeah, it takes a few minutes, but I get it together. And once I do, I'm going to have to let that rest for about 30 minutes to let gluten develop. Because when you use fats over about 5%, it seriously inhibits gluten development unless you do it like this. So while the dough is resting, I'm going to portion out my butter. I have 400 grams of butter total. I'm going to use 100 grams for the detrempe, or the base dough for the croissants. And I'm going to use the other 300 grams of butter for lamination. For those of you that don't know, lamination is the process of making layers of dough, butter, dough, to the point where in this you will have 73 layers, because you'll start with dough, butter, dough, and then you will give it a fourfold, which 3 times 4 is 12, minus 3 spots where dough touches dough, which makes 9 layers. Next you'll do a threefold. 9 times 3 is 27, minus 2 spots where dough touches dough is 25. Then 25 times 3 for the last threefold makes 75, minus 2 again for 2 spots where dough touches dough, which makes 73 layers. So only in a few folds you get to that number because it's exponential. And here I'm getting ready to make my butter block. I already portioned out the 100 grams eyeballed of what I'm going to use in the dough. And so I get my parchment paper and I make the square of the size I want out of the creases. And I try to place the butter to fill those creases properly here. The closer you get here, the easier the next step is. So I do recommend making some kind of an attempt to make it fit your creases, but don't over obsess about it being perfect, because you will be able to make it perfect in the next step. But I like making things easier, working smarter, not harder, so I fold everything in and then I flip it over so the seams are on the bottom. And this is a really magical moment where you can use the rolling pin. You're going to want to start by patting it out. And after you get some of the patting down to kind of loosen it up, you can start rolling. And when you're rolling butter, you want to try to roll more in a horizontal direction versus going down vertically. It's easier to break the butter that way. You can pat it vertically, but try not to roll it too much vertically. And you can see how cool this is, that it fills up the corners and that rectangle basically perfectly when you do this method. So that is your butter block. You can throw that in the fridge. And then once your 30 minutes of rest is over, You're going to knead in that 100 grams of butter, or 16.7%. And you can see some gluten has developed naturally through auto yeast. Not true auto yeast, which is just flour and water, but the flour and water, uninterrupted by any fat, has formed gluten. So now you're going to knead in the fat, which actually will take some serious effort, to be honest, and it takes some time. So you might have needed 3 to 4 minutes and rested for 30 minutes, but be ready to knead another 10 to even 15 minutes by hand to get all of this together. And what happens is your gluten network is already formed, so your oil can't coat the proteins that it would if you did it before, but it makes it a lot harder to incorporate into the dough because the fat will be in all the spaces where the gluten is not. So it will just seem to rub off at first, and your shape of your dough will look horrible. It'll start to look like a brain more than a ball of dough, but just have patience and don't worry about the screen. That's just from me speeding it up so much it doesn't know what to do, but this clip is almost over. It is 20 times the speed, if that makes sense. So you can see I'm manhandling this thing. I let it rest for about 5 to 10 minutes. I honestly didn't even get it to where it's like perfect. You can see it's still a little bit shaggy. So I just got it to a point like that and let it rest for 5 to 10 minutes to build some tension on the surface. And to do that, I dust the top of the dough ball and then I flip it over so it can slide, and I fold the sides into the middle, flip it back over where it sticks kind of, and build that surface tension where I go from 3 to 12 and tuck underneath, and you can see that's a much smoother dough ball now. And that is going to ferment in the fridge for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. If you're going to do your folds on 12-hour increments, I recommend you just do 12 hours. If you are going to fold the next day in 2-hour increments, then you can go 24 hours. So it really just depends on your schedule, but you should be okay either way because there's not that much yeast in this recipe, so the risk of overproofing is a lot smaller than a lot of other recipes where they call for a packet of yeast, which is an insane amount of yeast for something like this. And you can see I'm making this twice the length of my butter block. This is going to be for my dough block. I'm not going to make it twice the width, just twice the length. And that's where my now fermented dough will go. So that is the next step, is making the dough block. So I'm going to take my dough. It's got a little air to it, but nothing, not too much, not even close. And I'm just going to place that kind of in there and then do the same kind of thing I did for the butter block, but with the dough. I'm being a little careful using some bench flour just to make it so it doesn't stick to the parchment too much, but I'm not being liberal with it. I'm being more conservative. And I try to get some kind of pre-shape there, but I'm not too worried about it. But I'm going to close it carefully on my seams I made. It is very important you actually get those seams to fold, even if it takes you an attempt or two. Getting it right here just makes it way easier later. And then you're going to flip it so it's seam side down. Start by patting it, and you're going to roll it. Now, the only butter that's in this is the butter you kneaded into it, so if you have to go downwards a little bit here, you can, but once there is butter involved in lamination, you are not going to want to go in a vertical motion. You're going to want to stay horizontal so you don't break the butter that's laminated in. And it's crazy, but this does work with the dough as well. Now this dough is cold. And one thing about your croissant base dough is that it has a lot of butter in it. So when it is really cold, it is really firm, where without butter, this wouldn't be so firm. Or if that butter was water, it'd be extremely wet because it'd be like almost 80% hydration if butter was water, but it's not. Butter when it's cold is hard, so there's butter in the dough. So this dough firmed up a lot. But as you can see, the dough is starting to fill out the corners. But if any of you guys know from making square pies, Sicilians in Detroit, the corners like to come back. So this is going to need a rest too. A minimum rest of about 45 minutes in the fridge. And if you want to make your life a little bit easier, you can take your butter block out in that time, and when you come back you'll be actually ready to start the first fold, because your butter will be a little softened. It'll probably be around 60 degrees by that time, and it should be like the perfect temperature to get your first fold in actually. So here I am. It's got its rest, and I'm taking the butter block out of the fridge. So it is going to be really hard, and I learned that, and I took notes of that. So that's why I'm telling you now. See, it's stuck to the parchment just a little bit. No harm, no foul. Try to make sure the rectangle's good and make sure the size is double, and it is. And I'm going to stick my butter block right in the middle of the dough. And I'm going to do what's called a French lock-in method. That's where you fold half over on one side, fold half over on the other, connect the seam, all of the seams really, and you're going to want to let that rest again. What I recommend here is those seams on the side to kind of push them closer to the butter or cut them off or something, because I, on this batch, ended up with quite a bit of dough by those seams on the side, and I had to cut it off and put it on other parts of the dough. So yeah, this is a 73 layer croissant. It gets a 4-fold or an offset book fold, and 2 letter folds, which are a 3-fold. And on each 4-fold, there's 3 times where dough touches dough, so you have to get rid of 3 layers on your math problem there. And then every time you do a 3-fold, there's 2 layers where dough touches dough that you have to subtract. So for instance, this is 73 layers because dough butter dough makes 3 times 4 is 12, minus the 3 times dough touches dough is 9. 9 times 3 is 27, minus the 2 times that dough touches dough is 25. 25 times 3 is 75, minus the 2 times that dough touches dough is 73, which these are going to be 73 layer croissants. So before you do your folds, if you're using a sheeter, you can go to about 1 centimeter, but if you're doing this by hand, I suggest going even less, like a 1/2 centimeter. It'll just make the whole relaxation and rolling part easier. So the thinner you start your dough block and butter block actually will make the whole process easier as you go. I knew I didn't have that much table space. I still did have some excess I could have used, but this is one of my first batches of croissants, so I wanted to be careful. And I'm going to do now the first fold. I fold about 1/8 of the way over from the side there, and then I fold the rest all the way over to the seam and connect it, and then I'll fold that whole baby directly in half in the middle. And I remember getting a little bit confused here, but I figured it out. And you're going to do a better job than me at wrapping this up and hopefully being able to save the same wrap the whole time. But that's part of the beauty of this restaurant grade wrap I got. I have a ton of it. But there's of course the downside of plastic waste, which no one really likes. And you can see this is quite the struggle for me, because no matter what it looks like I'm about to do, I'm still going to need another piece of wrap to make this work. Yep. So yeah, just be better than me at that part right there. But this is going to need to relax 2 to 12 hours to be ready for your next fold, which will be the letter fold or three fold. And here you can see I'm learning per usual, so I'm writing notes as I go. I'm not trying to remember what I did later on like I am in this commentary. I have all my notes I can go back and look at. But that was fold number 1. And now we move on to fold number 2 here, which is going to be a letter fold or a three fold. And you want to get it really nice and thin. And I went to about 1 centimeter, but as I said, I learned you're going to want to go to about 1/2 centimeter. Fairly thin, almost thinner the better. But there's got to be a point where you go too thin that the butter kind of melts into the dough, and you really don't want that. You want there to be the separation to make the nice lamination. So the letter fold, you fold one side 2/3 of the way over and then fold the last third back over, and that would be a tri-fold. And you're going to wrap that again, and you're going to let it rest for another 2 to 12 hours. And I do believe the longer the better, because you're giving the dough more time to relax, making it easier to manipulate. And you are going through the long, slow fermentation of only using 0.3% instant yeast. And I think we all know that fermentation brings some of the best flavors, especially when paired with the sweetness from the sugar and the buttery flavor of the butter, the creamy goodness. So here's the last fold. I'm doing another letter fold here. I'm getting it nice and thin first, as thin as I realistically can get it, and then I start the folding process again. I go about 2/3 of the way over. You'll see, and once again I'm hesitating and thinking about what I'm about to do. So there we go, and then the last third will just get folded right on top of that, like so. And then once again, you're going to wrap it, let it sit for another 2 to 12 hours. Another good thing about these elongated weights is if you do 12 hours on each of these, you will most likely have a shorter proofing time when it comes time to proof, because once again, this is actually not proofing. This would still be in what I consider the primary fermentation, as they are not in their final shape yet. Once they're in their final shape, that's where I would call it proofing. So you're gonna let that rest for 2 to 12 hours, and the next step would be what I call rolling it out. You're gonna try to get it basically not as thin as possible, but about 1/2 centimeter should be a good thickness. And this batch ended up making 14, so you can sell a dozen for the price of your butter and your flour and your yeast and sugar and everything else, or maybe a bit more, and have 2 for yourself. And I, of course, I didn't sell these because I'm still experimenting, but I can do that in the future because I made them for people at work and they all said they would buy them. So this is how I did them. I was thinking of selling a dozen for like $20 because A, I just like doing it, and B, that'll buy me the stuff I spent the money on. So you can see as I roll it, it kind of comes back a little bit, so you can throw it back in the fridge for a couple hours and let it rest before cutting it. But I just got it nice and thin and just went and cut it. I'm feeling for thicker spots and trying to spread them out to the thin spots and make it as even as possible. And yeah, I've been doing dishes that day, so got my pizza cutter, or in this case, let's say pastry cutter, and I'm gonna try to make like a real looking rectangle here. So I'm cutting off some excess and actually putting it to the side, so when I go to roll, and I'm not actually cutting through here, I'm just kind of like, now I am, but I just kind of trace the spots that I might cut. I'm going from there. Now I've learned it's kind of better to do equilateral triangles more so than right triangles, but you can see I just rolled in the excess, and I could have went thinner than I went and wider to get more of the true croissant shape. These came out more like rolls, but they were still amazing, and I was not about to abort mission because my shape wasn't perfect. But that's just one of the things that I can work on in the future, and I will, because like I said, this was fun, challenging to me, and the reward was just off the chain. This was one of the tastiest things I've ever done. Sad to say it's not pizza, but holy cow. So yeah, see how I put all the excess in there, so it's kind of hidden in. Also, if you do let the sheet relax before cutting and shaping, it will less likely want to unroll on you because it'll be more relaxed. Some of these kind of did. The shapes that these ended up with were abstract and beautiful, but they were not quite the shapes of your usual croissant, to be honest. So yep, I got 14 out of that, and it's not ready to bake yet, so don't rush yourself. You still got to proof these things. I just proofed them on parchment paper. By the way, that roll from Publix, not saying any names, is the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with, because I don't use parchment paper very often, but I did have some at my house. And yeah, I didn't realize it wasn't going to be enough for just one sheet pan. So yeah, I got my 14 of these things. 9 on one, 5 on the other. Try to make them even. And you're going to want to wrap these guys when you proof so they don't dry out. And I recommend proofing these at room temperature for anywhere from like 2 to 6 hours. After that, they'll probably be overproofed. But I do not recommend proofing these in a warm place because you're risking melting the butter. When your croissants are done proofing, you're going to want to prep your egg wash because it only takes a few seconds. I use whole egg and milk, but you could also use, say, egg yolk and heavy cream, or whole egg and water. But I liked how it came out with the milk and the egg. You're going to want to be as careful as possible and try to hit the smooth part of the dough and stay away from the part where you see the layers, because you can glue them back together essentially with the egg wash. So dodge them as much as possible, but don't throw them out if you mess that up, because they'll still be wonderful. And you're going to bake at 375 degrees on the middle or top rack for 15 minutes, and then you're going to spin the pans 180 degrees because no heat comes off of the door, and go for another 10 minutes to make a total of 25 minutes. And they come out absolutely freaking gorgeous. So let's see a little bit of that oven spring here. This is 20 times speed. You can see them poofing a little bit. they just come out gorgeous. It's hard to see inside my oven with the camera, but I tried. So, yeah. After that 25 minutes, these guys are coming out. And I mean, as I said, my shaping was, as you can see, not even close to good. But I did not care. They tasted absolutely beautiful. So these are one of those things that, in a way, you can't really mess them up. I mean, as you can see, I did. But they were freaking amazing. They were super flaky, super soft, and just absolutely gorgeous. I did give a few to my dog, and he was absolutely fine. He loves his bread, so I had to give him some. Figured his tummy might hurt a little bit because of butter, but it didn't at all. And yeah, he's a good boy. He gets a croissant here and there. He's got to taste what it's like. So yeah, there's the rest of them. But yeah, I mean, I didn't really care about the final shape that much. It's something I can work on in the future. But I highly recommend you guys try this recipe out for yourself. I mean, these things were some of the best things I ever put in my stomach, and watching this back right now is making me want to make them again. And when I went to the store, I bought more butter and more milk for this, and more flour because I'll be going through it. And I'm going to make some and sell them to pay for my own and have free croissants. And maybe one day even have a little bakery. But yeah, I really hoped you guys enjoyed. I will have a few pictures of some croissants, the finished product, up close for you guys to look at. Leave some comments, and thanks again for watching, guys. Have a wonderful night.